Some encounters leave scars, others leave only questions. In the wilderness, shadows move with intelligence and raw power, striking without warning and leaving behind scenes that defy reason. From bikers struck down at a lonely gas station, to hunters whose Alaskan camp was left disturbingly arranged, the signs are too precise to ignore. In this video, we'll explore 6 encounters that reveal a presence in the wild, massive, intelligent, and far closer than we want to believe. On October 2nd, 2025, 3 bikers, Jake, Marco, and Lila, pulled into a lonely gas station on a quiet Texas back road. The place was empty, the night heavy with fog that thickened until even their headlights barely cut through the haze. The sound of engines died down, leaving only the soft hiss of fuel and the creak of illness. It felt strangely hollow, the kind of silence that seemed to press against the skin. Without warning, a guttural growl rolled across the lot, deep enough to vibrate the air. The sound grew louder, and the metal roof of the pump shelter rattled violently, as if shaken by an unseen force. The fog swallowed the edges of the lot, shadows shifting in unnatural ways. Then came the impact. A colossal shape burst from the haze, slamming into Jake and Marco with terrifying speed. Their motorcycles lifted off the ground, tossed aside like toys, crashing across the pavement in a tangle of twisted steel. Lila froze, her body locked with shock. She dropped behind her bike, clutching the ground as the roar of the strike echoed through the lot. The shadow was massive, broad-shouldered, upright, and moving with deliberate strength. She pounded the asphalt with trembling fists, the reality too much to process. The fog wrapped around the figure as if hiding its full shape, leaving only the outline of power and size. Around her, chaos grew stranger. Gas pumps bent inward, their steel frames twisted as if struck by enormous hands. A stack of tires that had leaned loosely against the wall earlier was now nudged into a precise formation, each one balanced with careful placement. The order stood in sharp contrast to the violence only moments before, as though whatever moved through the fog was not only destructive but calculating. The growls returned, circling the lot like low thunder. Lila kept still, hearing every snap of gravel, every groan of bent metal, every step that pressed into the damp earth. The ground shook with heavy impacts, each one spaced apart, each one too large to belong to anything known. Her breath fogged in front of her face as she hid, praying the shadow would pass. Then silence fell. When she dared to lift her head, the lot looked like a scene from another world. The motorcycles lay shattered, their chrome frames bent at harsh angles. 2 bodies were still on the ground, the fog coiling around them like a shroud. Enormous footprints circled the station, each one pressed deep into the wet soil, over 2 feet long, leading in loops before vanishing into the scrub beyond the lights. The tracks ended abruptly, as if the giant figure had dissolved back into the mist. Her memory held the final image, the glow of eyes reflecting faint light from the pumps, staring from the haze before fading away. That stare would never leave her. The morning after the attack, the gas station looked like a ruin. The pumps were bent and twisted, their frames bearing deep grooves that seemed impossible to make by any tool at hand. The broken motorcycles still lay where they had fallen, their parts scattered across the asphalt like pieces of shattered glass. Tire marks stopped halfway across the lot, as if something had lifted the weight clean off the ground. The silence of the place only made the scene heavier, each mark in the dirt telling its own story. Authorities arrived and studied the site with practiced eyes. They spoke of large wildlife, perhaps a bear drawn by fuel smells or food left behind. They wrote reports that blamed poor visibility in the fog, saying the bikers had panicked and met their deaths by accident. Yet no animal known could move objects into neat piles, and no fog could explain the massive tracks pressed deep into the earth. Still, the official word gave comfort to those who wished for an explanation. For Lila, there was no comfort. She stood near the wreckage with pale skin and shaking hands. unable to steady her breathing. Every detail of the night clung to her mind, replaying the moment the ground shook and her friends vanished in the fog. She remembered the glow of eyes reflecting light, the sound of heavy impacts circling the lot, and the deliberate order left among the chaos. She carried the weight of survival, a burden heavier than the twisted metal left behind. The footprints became the detail she could not forget, each one stretched far larger than any human, pressed so deep that water filled the impressions. They formed a loop around the station, closing in on the pumps before vanishing into the scrubland beyond. No drag marks, no broken soil led away. It was as if the figure had stepped into the mist and disappeared from the world. Locals began to whisper. Truck drivers passing through the back road spoke of strange sounds when the fog rolled thick. Others claimed that objects had been shifted at nearby stops, tools stacked into neat lines or stones arranged in strange patterns. Some even said they glimpsed a towering shape by the tree line, broad and silent, watching from a distance before slipping away. The gas station soon emptied of customers after nightfall, the story spreading faster than the repairs that could be made. For months, Lila avoided sleep. She woke to echoes of the growls, her mind filling with the image of bent pumps and crushed machines. She avoided open spaces filled with mist, convinced that something waited within the haze. To her, the explanation of wild animals and fog was worse than untrue. It was denial of the danger that had taken her friends. The gas station attack was left closed in official records, but among those who had heard the story, it became something else. Not an accident, not a bear, but a test from a predator that studied, struck, and then vanished into the silence of the night. On February 11, 2013, deep in the cold forests of Siberia, Yelena and Sergei chose to spend the night in a tree pod high among towering pines. The structure was suspended by ropes, built to give safety above the ground. Yet by dawn, that safety was gone. When trappers reached the area, the two were found lifeless beneath the broken pod, snow scattered with fragments of rope and wood. The platform above them was torn apart. Wooden supports bore long, deep marks, as if ripped or slashed by immense force. The lines were uneven but powerful, cutting into the beams with a strength no simple fall could explain. The ropes that had held the pod were frayed, not cut clean, but shredded into thin strands as though something had clawed them apart. Supplies that had been thrown from the platform during the night were not scattered randomly, as one would expect. Instead, they had been collected on the ground below and placed into one organized pile. Cooking pans, a lantern, food, and spare clothing rested together neatly on damp snow, as if arranged with intent. This order in the middle of destruction made the scene far more unsettling. A heavy smell still filled the clearing. It was acrid and harsh, a bitter stench that lingered even in the cold air. The trappers who arrived first could hardly breathe through it, a smell unlike any animal they knew. Around the base of the trees, the snow was disturbed by footprints too large to belong to any man. Each impression stretched more than 2 feet in length, pressed deeply into the damp ground, circling the scene before fading into the forest. The couple's fall could not explain what was found. Sergei's side showed crushing wounds, as though struck by great force, while Yelena's body bore heavy bruises across her back and arms. The damage did not match a simple drop from the height of the pod. The claw marks above, the frayed ropes, and the neat placement of supplies pointed to something far beyond an accident. The dogged silence of the forest only sharpened the fear. No tracks of wolves or bears were near. No signs of natural predators feeding or digging. Only the huge barefoot imprints remained, walking around the clearing again and again before vanishing into the fog between the trees. The trappers who stood in that place felt an overwhelming sense of being watched, though nothing stirred among the pines. When news reached officials, explanations followed quickly. A falling branch was blamed for striking the ropes, or perhaps human error in fastening the pod. A bear was suggested as the source of the scratches. But those who saw the prints, the pile of belongings, and the smell filling the air knew those claims did not fit. The forest had given signs of something deliberate, something hidden, that had chosen to move unseen while leaving a chilling message in its wake. The official report did little to quiet the unease that spread after the discovery. On paper, the explanation looked neat: a broken rope, a fall from height, and perhaps the presence of a large animal in the area were enough to close the file. Yet for those who had stood among the pines, the story would never feel finished. They remembered the sharp odor that lingered in the clearing, the unnatural piles of belongings, and the great impressions in the snow that ended, as if erased by the forest itself. The families of Yelena and Sergei received the results without protest in public, but in private grief and doubt grew heavy. They knew the pair were experienced in the wilderness. Both had climbed, camped, and traveled through remote areas for years. It was hard to accept that ropes could simply unravel in the night, or that marks gouged deep into wood came only from falling branches. Their deaths left more than sorrow. They left questions that had no certain answers. Among trappers and hunters who roamed those forests, the tale spread quickly. They spoke of nights when the trees carried strange sounds, low growls that rolled between trunks like distant thunder. Some recalled waking to find tools moved, firewood stacked oddly, or snow pressed into strange shapes, though they had blamed exhaustion or imagination at the time. With the tragedy, these old memories came back with new weight. The deliberate placement of the supplies beneath the destroyed pod matched their own small experiences, giving the sense of something watching, learning, and acting with purpose. The pungent odor was often remembered in their stories. Hunters compared it to smoke and rotting pine mixed together, thick enough to cling to clothes. Animals avoided the area for weeks after the deaths, leaving the forest silent except for the wind. That stillness became part of the memory of the site, as though even ordinary creatures knew better than to return. Years later, the location remained a place of unease. Travelers who heard the account avoided camping high in the trees. Some said the snow around the site never stayed smooth for long. Strange indentations appeared after storms, shallow yet wide, as though something returned briefly, circling before vanishing again. No one lingered there after dark, and trappers spoke quietly of shadows too tall to be men moving between the trunks. For officials, the case remained closed, but for locals, it became a warning. The wilderness was vast, and in its depths, there were forces not listed in any report. The deliberate destruction of the pod, the scratches on wood, the frayed cords, and the heavy smell formed a picture of a predator that was not acting on hunger alone. It seemed to choose its actions, striking and leaving behind symbols of control. The legacy of that night lived on in the silence of the clearing, in the fear of returning, and in the stories whispered by those who believed the forest had revealed only a fraction of what it held. The couple's end was not forgotten, but instead retold as proof that something massive and intelligent moved through the Siberian pines, unseen yet deliberate, patient yet merciless. On February 14, 2018, Ethan McLeod began his journey into the frozen reaches of the Yukon. A skilled survivalist, he had chosen the tundra for its emptiness, far from towns and roads, where only silence and snow ruled the land. He set up a small cabin as his base, stocking it with food, fuel, and gear, then kept careful notes in a journal that he carried everywhere. The pages soon filled with drawings of massive tracks, unlike any animal he had seen before. They were human in shape, but stretched well beyond the length of his boot, pressed deep into the crust of the snow. Alongside the sketches, he wrote about strange sounds he heard at night. Low growls, heavy thuds, and branches breaking in the distance. The The pages carried a foul, sharp smell, as though whatever he recorded left a trace of itself on the paper. The weather was harsh, but Ethan was used to cold and isolation. What unsettled him was not the wind or the snow, but the growing sense that something was watching him. Each night he heard noises circling the cabin, always just far enough away to remain unseen. At dawn, he sometimes found markings on nearby trees. The scratches rose higher than his head, cut deep into the bark in patterns that looked deliberate rather than random. Some were curved like hooks. Others formed lines as though part of a design. On the third evening, he returned to the cabin after checking his traps and noticed his sled had been moved. The heavy load sat dozens of meters from where he had left it, pulled smoothly across the snow without a sign of drag or stumble. His supplies, which he kept in order, were stacked into a neat pile near the sled. Nothing was missing, yet everything had been touched, shifted into sharp lines, and even towers of gear that made no sense. It was as if someone or something had been arranging them for a reason he could not guess. That night, the sounds came closer. The walls of the cabin creaked as if something heavy leaned against them. A shadow flickered past the frosted window, broad and tall, gone before he could focus. In his notebook, he wrote faster, the handwriting jagged, recording every sound. He described a figure he thought he glimpsed beyond the tree line, towering and upright, moving with purpose through the storm. The next morning, his tracks led away from the cabin into the white expanse, but no sign of his return was ever found. When searchers finally arrived, the cabin was intact, the stove cold, the notebook on the table open to a half-written page. The sled stood apart from the cabin, the supplies piled in geometric shape. Surrounding the camp were deep prints that circled and looped, then faded into the endless snow, vanishing without a trace. The notebook remained the only voice of what had happened at the tundra. Each page told of something not only powerful, but patient, watching and shaping the world around Ethan before he disappeared into the wilderness. The searchers who studied the camp described a scene that felt more arranged than abandoned. The cabin itself showed no struggle, yet everything around it bore signs of deliberate movement. The sled stood far from its usual place, heavy with untouched supplies, while smaller items were balanced in unnatural stacks. No scavengers had disturbed the site. No tracks of wolves or bears crossed the snow. Instead, the area was lined with deep impressions, long and narrow, circling in wide loop before stopping at nothing. The prints did not fade toward the horizon. They ended suddenly as if their maker had lifted away from the ground. Authorities explained the disappearance with a simple answer. They said Ethan had wandered too far from the cabin, caught by cold or exhaustion, lost to the harsh tundra. They chose not to dwell on the careful piles of gear or the looping mark that had no beginning or end. The foul smell that lingered on the notebook pages was never addressed. In official report, these details vanished, replaced by plain words of exposure and miscalculation. Those who knew the man struggled to accept the account. He had lived for years in harsh climate, always cautious and always aware of the risk. His notes showed not weakness, but preparation. He described being observed, his routines studied, his camp touched while he slept. The journal did not read like the writing of someone careless. It read like the record of someone being tested by something both unseen and powerful. Within nearby settlements, the story grew darker. Elders spoke of tall figures that crossed the white plains, silent but watchful. Hunters claimed to have seen shapes moving far across ridges, vanishing before they could follow. Some described the same sour smell that clung to the notebook, strong enough to catch on the wind. They said the patterns carved into trees were not random, but warnings or marks of territory, made to remind those who passed that they were not alone. For months after, the cabin remained untouched, a place avoided even by those who trapped and hunted nearby. Travelers felt uneasy when passing close, hearing faint noises at night that carried across the snow. The memory of Ethan's disappearance became part of local caution, told to remind others not to stay too long in places where silence feels too heavy. The thought that something might be studying from the shadows kept many away. The notebook itself was preserved, its pages filled with drawings of prints, lines, and strange shape. Each sketch showed his effort to understand what was moving near him. But the last page ended abruptly, words jagged, unfinished. It gave the sense of a writer forced to stop, interrupted before he could describe what stood before him. The disappearance was left unresolved, a blank in the record. But to those who saw the camp, the truth was clear. The patterns, the track, the smell, and the silence all pointed to a presence that was not chance or mistake. It was patient, intelligent, and far older than the cabins and trails of men. On October 18, 2020, 3 friends named Tom, Rachel, and Luis traveled into the deep woods of Northern California to spend the night near an old cabin. The day was calm, and the forest seemed quiet as they set up their camp. By evening, the air grew heavy, and the silence of the pines felt unnatural, as if the forest itself waited for something. As the last light faded, the first sound came, a dull thud that seemed to shake the trunks around them. At first, they thought it was falling branches, but the noise grew louder, closer, and more rhythmic. Then, without warning, rocks began rolling from the slope above their camp. Huge boulders tumbled downward, striking the ground with violent force. The friends scrambled for safety, their bodies pressed close to the cabin wall, while more stones came down in waves. Each impact felt deliberate, not random, as if something had aimed them with intention. One of the massive rocks crashed into a tree just feet from Luis. The strike was so hard, it shook loose branches from the crown and split bark wide open. Knocked off balance, he fell hard to the ground, but managed to scramble away before another stone slammed nearby. His chest heaved as he crawled to cover, realizing the danger was not natural. Low, guttural growls echoed from the darkness, weaving through the mist like a warning. The sounds were unlike anything they had ever heard, too deep for a bear, too long for any known animal. Shadows shifted between the pines, tall and broad, moving upright. Each growl was followed by silence, broken only by the sound of more rocks sliding into the clearing. The campers clung to the hope that the storm of stones would end, yet the attacks continued for long minutes that stretched like hours. The cabin shook as smaller rocks struck the roof, rattling the old wood beams. Dust fell from the rafters, covering their bags and bedding. The fire pit collapsed as stones scattered across it, sending sparks hissing into the night. Their campsite became a ruin of broken branches and shattered ground. The forest, once still, now felt alive with menace. The hours dragged until the dark began to thin. Finally, the first pale light of dawn revealed what had been hidden. Enormous prints marked the mud, each impression longer than a boot and pressed deep as though by something heavy beyond belief. The tracks circled both the cabin and the camp, looping again and again as though the intruder had studied every detail. Near the doorway and around the pit, stones had been gathered and stacked into piles. Each formation was precise, placed with care, almost like a message meant to be seen. No one could explain why or how such heavy objects had been moved without sound, other than the rolling strike from above. The forest seemed untouched otherwise, as if the attacker had melted back into the trees. By morning, the creature was gone, but the memory of the night stayed heavy. The rising sun revealed more than just the scattered campsite. The 3 friends saw the destruction clearly now, and every detail filled them with dread. Burnt wood from the broken fire lay across the ground, and food bags were left untouched, as if hunger had not been the purpose of the night. The rock piled near the door, and pit formed strange shape, as though arranged with thought. The prints in the soil circled the site with a pattern too precise to dismiss as chance. Shaken and exhausted, They gathered what little they could and left without delay. Each step away from the clearing felt heavy, but the need to escape outweighed their fear. Even as they moved down the trail, the silence pressed close, and every sound of breaking twig made them feel followed. By the time they reached the nearest road, the three were pale and trembling, unable to explain in simple words what they had seen. When authorities arrived later, the story changed. They spoke of rock slides, unstable ground, and wild animals that may have wandered too close. The strange piles of stone were brushed off as the campers' own work, the huge track dismissed as distorted impressions in soft mud. To the officials, the events were nothing unusual, but the survivors knew better. They had felt the force of the boulders, heard the guttural growls, and seen the shapes in the trees. Back in town, whispers began to spread. Old locals spoke of night when strange sounds carried across the ridges, low calls that made hunting dogs whine and cattle stir in their pens. Some remembered finding objects stacked in odd ways on trails or riverbank, as if left by unseen hands. For many, the story of the three hikers fit perfectly with tales that had passed quietly for years. A being with strength beyond belief, moving through the forest with intelligence, watching campsites from the shadows. Tom and his friends could not shake the memory. Luis carried bruises from where he had fallen, each mark a reminder of how close he had come to being crushed. Rachel could not sleep without hearing the echoes of rolling stone and the low sounds that had carried through the fog. Tom avoided long trips into the wilderness afterward, his confidence in the safety of the forest shattered. The cabin where the event had unfolded was soon abandoned. People avoided it, calling it cursed ground. Even passing hunters refused to stop there, saying the place carried a weight, a silence too deep to ignore. Some swore that fresh tracks reappeared after rain, circling the site before vanishing into the slopes above. The piles of stone, too, were said to return, shifted into new shape no one admitted to making. Though no official report marked it as anything more than an accident, the truth lived in the memories of those who had stood there. They carried the certainty that something powerful had chosen to reveal itself only for a moment, leaving signs that could not be denied. And in the deep woods of Northern California, the fear remained that one day it would return. On May 22, 2025, Lucas Brandt arrived at a lonely alpine lake hidden deep in Austria's mountains. The day was dark with heavy rain, and a thick fog rolled down from the ridges, covering the water in pale mist. He had come to fish and spend time alone in the wild, bringing his dog for company. The silence of the forest was broken only by the soft sound of water hitting rock and the distant rush of wind between the peaks. As he stood near the muddy shore, his eyes caught movement through the gray veil. A towering figure stood partly in the shallow water, its frame broad and powerful, its hair hanging in wet strands that dripped steadily into the lake. Lucas froze behind a boulder, unable to move, heart racing as the shape shifted back toward the tree line. Slowly, without haste, it retreated into the woods, swallowed by fog until only the ripples in the water showed it had been there at all. Although shaken, Lucas decided to remain at the site, hoping to see more. He pitched a small tent by the lakeside as the evening darkened. His dog, restless from the start, growled toward the shadows that ringed the forest. The stillness was soon broken by noises that chilled him. First came the heavy thuds, as though something enormous stepped between the trees. Then came deep, distant growls that rolled across the lake's surface, echoing in the night. Most unsettling of all was a steady tapping that rose and fell in a rhythm, as if something struck wood in a deliberate beat. The forest around the lake felt alive, every sound magnified by the fog. Lucas lay awake, every muscle tense as his dog refused to settle, hackles raised, staring out into the blackness. Time passed slowly, each noise making him think the presence was creeping closer. He had no doubt that whatever he had glimpsed earlier was still near, watching from the tree line, hidden by the mist. When dawn finally arrived, the rain eased, but the fog clung tightly to the ground. Lucas, exhausted and uneasy, decided to leave without delay. As he packed, something caught his attention on the shoreline. The mud carried enormous barefoot prints, each one over 2 feet long, pressed so deep they held water. They were not straight or natural like human steps. Instead, they looped in unsettling patterns, circling sections of the waterline before twisting back into the trees. The strange signs left Lucas with no question that the night had been more than imagination. He guided his dog away quickly, leaving the tent behind in his rush to escape the unnerving scene. Later, when he reported what he had seen to rangers, they dismissed it as nothing more than fog and tired eyes. Yet he knew the truth. Something vast and unknown had moved through the mist, leaving only patterns in mud and echoes of the night to mark its presence. The days following his escape from the lake were filled with unease. Lucas tried to return to his normal routine, but his mind often replayed the strange patterns stamped into the shore. Each time he closed his eyes, he could still hear the heavy thuds echoing through the forest and the rhythmic tapping that seemed to grow louder in memory. His dog also behaved differently, waking often at night and barking at nothing, as if it too could not forget what it had sensed. When he shared his account with rangers, they offered polite smiles and careful words. They pointed to exhaustion, poor weather, and the power of imagination to create illusions. Yet their explanations brought him no comfort. He knew he had stood frozen behind that rock, watching a shape wade through the water, its size far beyond any human. He knew the mud bore unnatural loops that no person could have made in such steady order. The denial of officials only deepened his worry, leaving him alone with the memory. In the weeks that followed, Lucas avoided the mountains. The places he once loved now carried a heavy shadow. Friends noticed his silence and the way he often scanned the distance, as if expecting something to emerge from the mist. He did not share the full story with them, afraid that they too would dismiss it as fantasy. Instead, he kept the details close, speaking only of the sense of dread that lingered. Locals who had lived near the alpine valleys for generations whispered other stories. They spoke of hunters who had returned without their catch, their gear found stacked in odd ways by riversides. They spoke of fishermen who abandoned lakes after hearing strange calls through the fog. None of these accounts were written in official records, yet they matched his own experience in unsettling detail. Lucas began to see his encounter as part of a larger pattern, one that others had quietly endured but rarely shared. The strongest reminder of that night came from his dog. The animal refused to approach bodies of water after their return. It growled at the sound of rain and pulled back whenever fog crept across the ground. Its fear seemed to confirm what Lucas already believed, that the presence had been real and not a trick of tired eyes. Months passed, but the weight of that morning never lifted. Lucas often dreamed of standing again on the lakeshore, the mist curling low, the figure moving with slow strength before vanishing into trees. He would wake breathless, his heart pounding as though he had been there once more. Even in daylight, he sometimes caught himself turning quickly, convinced something was following just beyond sight. Though officials closed the report with no further action, Lucas remained haunted. To him, the prints in the mud and the echoes in the fog had revealed something beyond ordinary nature. It had not attacked, but it had shown its presence with careful signs, as if reminding him that the wild still held mysteries far greater than human understanding. On January 14th, 2023, a group of 4 hunters set up camp near a frozen stream deep inside the Alaskan wilds. Tyler, Megan, Connor, and Jenna had spent the day tracking a moose across the icy terrain, dragging it back toward their tents as evening fell. The air was sharp, biting, and the silence of the forest seemed endless. As night settled, the snow around their camp grew heavy with fog that rolled low across the trees. The moose they had brought back was partly skinned and left near the edge of the clearing. What seemed ordinary soon turned strange. The animal's body was no longer lying in a natural shape. Instead, its limbs were folded and turned in angles that made no sense, as though arranged by unseen hands. The hunters tried to ignore the unsettling sight, but fear began to rise. Not long after, strange noises drifted through the trees. Low growls vibrated against the frozen ground, steady and guttural, unlike anything they had heard before. The sounds moved around them, circling, echoing through the night air. Branches snapped somewhere in the mist, and thuds shook the snow-covered ground as if something heavy was pacing just beyond sight. When the search team later arrived, they found a scene that carried more questions than answers. The snow was smooth, with no marks of a struggle, except for massive footprints that looped unnaturally around the tents. Each impression was well over 2 feet long and pressed deep into the frozen soil. The tracks circled and then disappeared completely at the edge of the forest, leaving no path of escape. Even more disturbing was the careful placement of supplies. Gear was not scattered, but instead stacked neatly in piles, positioned with strange precision. Cooking utensils were balanced against each other, and clothing folded into unnatural heaps. The order felt purposeful, as though someone or something had taken the time to rearrange every object. The most shocking detail was the state of the hunters themselves. Tyler and Megan were discovered shivering, their clothing partly stripped away despite the freezing air. Both bore deep scratches across their bodies and severe bruises, as if struck by immense force. They were alive, but unable to form full sentences, whispering about moving shadows and upright shapes between the trees. Their fear was so strong, they could not stop trembling. Connor and Jenna were found nearby, sitting motionless in the snow. Their eyes were wide open, but their lips refused to speak. They seemed frozen not by cold alone, but by terror so overwhelming it had stolen their voices. Around them lingered a sharp, acrid smell, thick in the air, stinging the senses. The campsite was silent, the atmosphere heavy, as though whatever had caused this had not left, but simply melted into the wilderness. Searchers felt as if they too were being watched from the trees, leaving them unsettled long after leaving the frozen stream. Authorities arrived quickly after the searchers gave their reports, but what they recorded sounded nothing like the real scene. The official version spoke of cold weather, fatigue, and confusion, claiming the hunters had suffered from exposure and mental strain. The strange tracks, the neatly arranged gear, and the condition of the moose were dismissed as unimportant. Yet anyone who had walked through the clearing knew that the silence in those woods had been shaped by more than snow and wind. Medical staff attempted to treat Tyler and Megan, but their wounds looked too precise to match any fall or accident. Scratches ran across their arms and backs in straight lines, deep enough to scar, but not to kill. Bruises shaped like large, blunt impacts covered their ribs and shoulders. Their behavior was just as disturbing as their injuries. They whispered about tall shapes in the trees, their eyes darting at every sound, shivering even in heated rooms. No treatment calmed them fully. Connor and Jenna were no better. Though uninjured, they refused to speak. They sat still, gazing at walls as though still seated on the frozen ground, locked in the memory of something no one else could see. Efforts to reach them failed. The silence of their expressions spoke louder than any words. The smell reported by the first search team never faded. It lingered in clothing, in tents, and in the air near the abandoned camp. Strong and bitter, it clung to everything, leaving an impression of something animal yet unnatural. No fire, no cleaning, and no explanation could erase it. The odor became one of the most frightening details for those who had visited the site. Among local villages, talk spread quickly. Elders recalled stories of massive beings moving silently across frozen lands, leaving trails of fear without ever showing their full form. The stories matched the details: the heavy steps, the rearranged tools, the untouched food, and the strange order left in chaos. Some hunters swore they had seen enormous tracks before, always vanishing at the forest edge as though the creature dissolved into the trees. Guides who once offered trips into that region soon refused to travel near the stream. They claimed the ground there carried a weight that did not belong to any ordinary animal. Even in daylight, the forest seemed hushed, as though holding its breath. The partially folded moose became another piece of evidence in whispers, described as a warning left behind by something far greater than human strength. For families of the four hunters, closure never came. The case was marked as exposure combined with stress, written neatly into records, but the survivors lived with scars far deeper than what showed on skin. Their eyes carried the look of people who had been studied, toyed with, and nearly destroyed by a presence beyond understanding. The Alaskan wilderness held its secrets, as it always had. The prints in the snow melted, but the memory of the unnatural order remained. Those who entered afterwards spoke of silence so complete it felt alive, as though the watcher still stood just out of sight, waiting patiently for the next intrusion.